Dual booting Windows and Linux is easy, till it isn't. Everything works fine. You install Linux, you reboot. You see both operating systems, you feel smart. Then one Windows update happens, and suddenly, your boot menu is gone. Linux doesn't load, or worse, BitLocker locks your drive. And now you're staring at a recovery screen wondering what just happened. If that sounds dramatic, it's not. This happens all the time. Not because Linux is unstable. Not because dual booting is impossible. But because Windows assumes it owns your machine. And unless you set things up carefully, Windows can absolutely disrupt your dual boot without warning. So today we're not just talking about how to dual boot. We're talking about how to dual boot safely, stress-tested, fail-safe, built to survive Windows updates. Because here's the reality. Most tutorials show you how to install Linux next to Windows. Very few show you how to protect that setup long-term. That's where things go wrong. Let's start with the biggest mistake people make. They jump straight into installation without preparing Windows properly. Before you even think about installing Linux, you need to stabilize the Windows side. It means disable fast startup, understand BitLocker status, check secure boot configuration, verify your partition layout. If you skip those steps, you're building on unstable ground. Now let's talk about BitLocker. This is critical. On many modern Windows systems, BitLocker is enabled by default, especially on newer hardware. And here's what people don't realize. When you modify partitions or change bootloaders, BitLocker can detect that as a security event, and it may trigger recovery mode. If you don't have your recovery key backed up, you're locked out. So step 1 in any safe dual boot plan. Check if BitLocker is enabled. If it is, either properly suspend it before making changes, or fully understand how to manage recovery keys. Never assume it won't matter. Now let's talk about partitioning. Sloppy partition layout causes future pain. You need a clean Windows partition. Unallocated space for Linux. A clear understanding of UEFI and EFI system partitions. Modern systems use UEFI, not legacy BIOS. That means your bootloader lives inside the EFI partition, and when Linux installs GRUB, it adds itself there. Windows updates can sometimes reset boot priorities inside UEFI. That's why understanding your firmware boot order is essential. Not optional, essential. Another mistake? Not backing up before starting? If you're serious about protecting your system, you should create a full disk image before making major changes. This is where tools like Clonezilla come in. Instead of hoping nothing goes wrong, you create a restorable snapshot. If Windows decides to fix your bootloader later, you restore. That's control. Dual booting safely isn't about luck. It's about preparation. Now here's something else most tutorials skip: secure boot. Modern Linux distributions handle secure boot well. But if your system is configured oddly, mismatches can happen. Before installing Linux, understand whether secure boot is enabled and how your distro handles it. Blindly disabling everything isn't always the best solution. Know what you're doing, because dual boot done carelessly works, till it doesn't. But dual boot done properly, it's stable for years. You can run Windows for what you need, Linux for what you prefer. No interference, no panic updates, no broken boot menus. But we're just getting started. Because next, we're going to walk through the stress-tested structure that keeps Windows from messing with your Linux installation. And that structure makes all the difference. Alright, now let's talk about the actual structure that keeps your dual boot stable long-term. Because the goal isn't just to install Linux, the goal is to survive Windows. Step 1. Shrink Windows properly. Do not use third-party partition tools inside Linux to shrink your Windows partition first. Use Windows Disk Management. Why? Because Windows understands its own file system best. It reduces the risk of corruption and avoids triggering unnecessary BitLocker or recovery flags. So inside Windows, disable fast startup temporarily, suspend BitLocker. If enabled, run disk cleanup, run a quick disk check. Then shrink the partition. Leave clean, unallocated space. Don't format it. Don't touch it. Just leave it empty for Linux. Now step 2. Understand your FE partition. Most modern systems have a small EFI, system partition, usually around 100 to 500 megabytes. This is where bootloaders live. Windows has its bootloader there. Linux will add GRUB there. You do not need multiple FE partitions in most setups. And creating extra ones unnecessarily can cause confusion later. When you install Linux, make sure you're installing in UEFI mode, not legacy mode. The installer detects the existing EFI partition. GRUB installs to that EFI partition properly. Mixing legacy and UEFI boot modes is one of the fastest ways to create a broken system. Now let's talk about the bootloader strategy. GRUB usually becomes the default bootloader after installation. That's fine. But here's the failsafe mindset. Never rely on just one entry. After installation, go into your firmware settings and confirm boot order. Make sure Linux Boot Manager exists. Windows Boot Manager still exists. Some firmware allows you to choose either directly, that's important. If a Windows update resets boot order, you can manually change it back without reinstalling anything. That alone saves hours of frustration. Here's something advanced but powerful. Separate your systems logically. If you really want maximum protection, use separate physical drives. Windows on one SSD. Linux on another SSD. This is the cleanest dual boot setup possible. Windows updates are far less likely to interfere because each OS lives independently. The only shared element is the bootloader. If something goes wrong, you can even unplug one drive temporarily. That level of separation adds safety. Now, let's talk about backups. This is where most people get lazy. Before installing Linux, create a full system image of your Windows drive. Not just file backups, a full image. Clonezilla is perfect for this. Boot into Clonezilla, create a disk image, store it externally. Something catastrophic happens, you restore. No panic, no data loss. And here's another critical habit. Keep a live Linux USB around. If your bootloader gets messed up, you can boot from USB and repair GRUB. Most issues are recoverable if you're prepared. Now, let's address common pitfalls. Pitfall 1. Windows updates resetting boot priority. Solution. Check firmware boot order after major updates. Pitfall 2. BitLocker. Triggering after partition changes. Solution. Always suspend BitLocker before modifying partitions and back up the recovery key. Fall 3. Fast startup causing file system conflicts. Solution. Disable fast startup permanently. Pitfall 4. Mixing legacy BIOS with UEFI. Solution. Stay consistent. Use UEFI across both systems. Dual boot failures rarely happen because Linux is unstable. They happen because Windows assumes it's alone. But when you structure your setup correctly, you remove Windows' ability to accidentally override your configuration. And that's the difference between a fragile dual boot and a professional one. Now, let's talk about recovery strategies. Because even with preparation, things can go wrong. And knowing how to recover is what separates panic from control. Now let's talk about recovery. Because even with perfect preparation, things can still go sideways. Windows updates are unpredictable. Firmware updates can reset boot order. Users sometimes accidentally re-enable settings that cause conflicts. The difference between a disaster and a minor inconvenience is knowing how to respond. Scenario 1. Windows Update removes GRUB from the boot menu. This is common. You restart after an update, and suddenly Windows boots directly with no Linux option. Don't panic. First, enter your firmware settings, usually by pressing F2, F12, delete, or ESC during startup. Check the boot order. Often the Linux boot manager is still there, just not first in priority. Move it back to the top. Save, reboot. Problem solved. If the Linux entry is missing entirely, that's when your live USB becomes essential. Boot from your Linux USB. Open a terminal. Mount your Linux partition. Reinstall GRUB. Most distributions have simple guides for this. It sounds scary, but it's usually a 10-minute fix.
Ow!
Scenario 2. BitLocker recovery screen. You boot, and Windows asks for a 48-digit recovery key. This happens when Windows detects hardware or partition changes. If you backed up your recovery key properly, you enter it once and continue. If you didn't, that's when panic sets in. This is why preparation matters. Always back up your BitLocker key to an external location, not just your Microsoft account. Offline copy, secure storage, because if you lose access to that key, you lose access to your data. Scenario 3. Bootloader corruption after firmware update. Sometimes a BIOS or UEFI update resets secure boot settings or boot priorities. After any firmware update, double-check secure boot status. Boot mode, UEFI versus legacy. Boot order. These small checks prevent hours of troubleshooting. Now let's talk about long-term stability. Once your dual boot is set up correctly, leave it alone. Don't constantly resize partitions. Don't experiment on your primary machine without backups. If you want to test risky configurations, use a spare system or virtual machine. Stable dual boot can last for years if you respect the structure. Another smart strategy? Keep your Linux home directory backed up regularly. Use tools like Rink or Timeshift. If something breaks beyond quick repair, you can reinstall Linux without losing personal data. That's the beauty of Linux. Separation between system and user data is clean. Now here's something important. Dual boot isn't for everyone. If you constantly need both systems at the same time, virtualization may be better. If you want full isolation, separate machines may be better. But if you want flexibility, Windows for specific tasks, Linux for control and privacy, dual boot remains powerful. The key isn't fear of Microsoft. It's understanding how Windows behaves. Windows isn't malicious. It's designed with the assumption that it's the only operating system. When you introduce Linux, you're stepping outside that assumption. That requires planning. And once you plan properly, Windows updates stop being terrifying. They become manageable. Dual boot is easy, until it isn't. But with proper preparation, partition discipline, BitLocker awareness, secure boot understanding, firmware checks, and full backups, you remove the chaos. You move from hoping nothing breaks to knowing you can fix it. And that confidence changes everything.